Hello, these are flip notes 4b part 4 and the last in our unit on social psychology. And in this section, we're talking about group affiliation, how we participate in groups. Let's go. So there are several cultural phenomena about whether or not you feel more loyalty towards the group or yourself. So we'll refer to each of these terms: individualism, collectivism, and multiculturalism. Individualism is pretty much what it sounds like, that you set yourself as the priority, the individual. So you're emphasizing more of your personal goals, your autonomy, which is your independence and your individual rights. We celebrate personal achievements in individualistic cultures, and self-expression is really highly valued. The U.S. is a classic example of an individualist culture, very centered on me, the you, but also those who are closest to you, over the overall society. So your own career path may be more focused in your personal interests rather than your family's expectations. In contrast to that, we have collectivism, where the orientation is more towards group goals, and interdependence, which is the opposite of independence. That's when you're working together, and the importance of social harmony. So here, the success and well-being of the group takes precedence. A lot of Asian cultures, like Japan, China as well, are representative of a collectivist society. In Japan, the employees tend to be very loyal to their companies. Teamwork is important, and that leads to very strong group cohesion and corporate success. And then multiculturalism is the third societal view that promotes the coexistence of diverse cultural groups and recognizes that there are cultural differences and encourages integration and mutual respect. Canada is described as a good example of multicultural policies in which they really try to integrate immigrants into their society and respect their individual cultural identities and have a more inclusive society. So group membership, what happens when the groups don't have the same views? They tend to polarize. So polarize is being kind of against each other. So what happens is when groups are against each other, it tends to cause the group's initial leanings to become even more extreme. So for example, a person's political views may have been fairly mild, but if they were to attend a political rally, then they may become even stronger. So when individuals in a group reinforce each other's viewpoints. So like-minded individuals may become more radical in their views after discussing issues with a homogenous group. So when you talk to people who are similar to you and you're like, yeah, I do agree with that, and it kind of reinforces your ideas. So you become even more extreme or polarized in your views. Groupthink is when a group comes together to make a decision, but the desire for the group to kind of get along and come to a conclusion or an answer sometimes takes precedence over having the best solution. And it can lead to poor decision making. So this often happens when the group is isolated in their decision making. They think they're unanimous. A lot of times it happens when there's a strong leader in the group and everybody kind of caves to their desires. And then there's this feeling of self-censorship that people don't want to really speak up against the other person. The Bay of Pigs invasion in history is a classic example of groupthink, where the government officials ignored the risks of using different people, including local Cubans, in their attack plan, and it resulted in a failed mission. But again, groupthink, sometimes we think of this as basically we come together to make a quick decision, but it's often a bad decision. The diffusion of responsibility is about what happens when you have a group, but nobody really seems to act. So when you're in a group, you feel less personally accountable for your actions because you think other people are there to act as well. So that decreases your motivation to act. So for example, if somebody is facing an emergency situation and there are lots of other bystanders around, a lot of times people are not quick to act because they think somebody else will do that, will help. For example, like if somebody's stuck on the side of the road on a busy road, people are less likely to stop. Whereas if it's a quiet road and you're the only one driving by, you'll feel more pressured to stop. So that desire not to stop because you think other people will help is called the bystander effect. And we'll get to a slide here in a minute that explains what influences whether or not you will stop. The case of Kitty Genovese is a classic example of the diffusion of responsibility leading to the bystander effect. Kitty Genovese is a woman who was murdered in 1964 in Queens, New York. She was stabbed to death repeatedly in the middle of the night. And it was believed that there were a lot of witnesses who could hear what was happening to her. Like it was in an alley, it was summertime, people had windows open. And a New York Times article published that there were 38 citizens who watched or knew or could hear about the murder, but nobody did anything. And it kind of led to this big societal attack about why would nobody do anything? And it became this social study about the bystander effect, that they all assumed somebody else would do something. Over the years, a lot of people have investigated the case and realized it wasn't quite that situation, that there were less witnesses. A lot of them did not actually hear, that some of them did actually call the police, but the police were very slow to respond. It's a really interesting story. There's several documentaries about it on streaming sources, so I encourage you to look into her case. Social loafing is a part of that diffusion of responsibility, and I use this term in class every now and then, especially when we do group projects, but it's when you're in a group, individuals tend to exert less effort because they think other people will do the work. So you work less than when you work alone. So you feel that your contributions are less noticeable because of that diffusion of responsibility. So you rely on others to do the workload. Social loafers. I love this meme. Group project, they got this. When I die, I want the people I did projects with to lower me into my grave so they can let me down one last time. I love that one. All right, de-individuation is another example of what happens to your identity when you're within a group, that you feel like you're not noticed as much because there's so many others around. So you lose self-awareness, and again, you lose that personal accountability. So often it leads to characteristic behavior or behavior that's not characteristic, and a lot of times it's uninhibited. So on like the positive end of this is why like at the prom or a homecoming dance, you're more likely to get out and dance when there's a crowd because you feel like people can't see you so much. On the darker end, when there's riots or vandalism or people are looting after a natural disaster where they're going in and stealing things, people will do things that they would not normally do, but they lose their identity and they feel like people won't notice them as much. A little more now on the group influence and interaction. So social facilitation is the trend that we tend to perform better in front of a group, but that's on a task that we're good at or it's simple. So for example, something you're good at, like a lot of concert performers or a lot of athletes may perform better in front of a big crowd than they might just like in practice. The opposite of that is social inhibition. If the task is really complex or it's new, then that they may worsen under observation. So an example of this would be performing on the balance beam is super tough and complex, and knowing that lots and lots of people are watching you might make that more difficult. The false consensus effect is our tendency to overestimate agreement from others. This kind of goes along with the representative heuristic. So representative heuristic is where you form your assumptions based on information that's readily available to you. So you have this bias where you think everybody else believes the same thing as you. So if you dislike a new policy at work, then you assume everybody else must dislike it as well. If you and your friends like a musical artist, then you tend to think, oh, maybe everybody else does too. So you believe that others agree with you when that's not always the case. Superordinate group goals are when groups that normally do not get along together, disparate groups, unify under a common goal. And it's usually where they have to work together in order to make something happen. They transcend their individual differences and promote unity because the common goal cannot be achieved unless everybody works together. A classic example of this was after 9/11 when Republicans and Democrats came together to pass laws that would help to fight the war on terror. During a natural disaster, rival community groups may come together to provide aid in the common goal of relief and recovery. We'll talk about the Robbers Cave experiment, but it was about boys at a camp and how they had to come together in some activities. It was an actual experiment, but they believed they had to work together in some activities for them to survive while they were at this camp. A social trap is when people take their own individual interests over the group, and that can lead to negative long-term consequences. So usually there's some kind of conflict between, should I do what's best for me or the collective welfare, overall society? A good example of this is overfishing. So an individual fisherman benefits. Like if they're catching a lot of fish, they're catching a lot of younger fish, then that's good for them because they're increasing their numbers and making more money. But they're not leaving enough for everybody else. If they're keeping the small fish and they're not throwing them back so that they can grow larger and they can breed more, then that harms the fishing community in the long run. Another example that's commonly used, if a student cheats on a test because it's good for them, knowing that if the teacher catches them, they're going to punish the whole class. So the social trap is, should I do what's good for me or worry about if the teacher catches me, she's going to punish everybody? So behavior is not always bad. There's pro-social behavior that results from being in groups. So altruism is selfless behavior. So this is when an individual acts to benefit others and they don't expect anything, any personal gain or reward. They're truly altruistic. And that's motivated because they do actually have a genuine concern for the welfare of others. An example of this would be, a major example of this would be somebody who's willing to donate a kidney to a stranger that you find out that you're a match. That is a huge personal medical risk and discomfort and time and money too often, and risk that what if you needed that later, but you're doing it to save another's life without expecting anything in return. There's rules about, like ethically, like you cannot be paid for it. So it is a truly altruistic gift. The social debt is kind of the result of doing something. You have to consider, if I'm willing to do something altruistic, what is it going to cost me? And that's that social debt. The social reciprocity norm says that if somebody does something for you, you should in kind repay that kindness. So the expectation that people will respond to each other in a similar way. So it's this mutual benefit and cooperation. One example of this is a lot of charities will mail things out like mailing labels, address labels, little stationery items with the hope that you will want to reciprocate the kindness that they gave you something and that in return you will make a donation to their charity. Another example, if someone were to help you with a project, then you feel obligated to help them later. And I know it happens with cheating. Somebody gives you the answers to something, so you're expected to help them out later on. That's that social reciprocity norm. So this brings back again that bystander effect. So what makes you decide whether or not you want to help that person, whether it's the reciprocity norm or in a situation of danger? And the variables that are part of that are the situational and attentional variables, and they can help predict when people will help. So the situational variables refer to the environmental factors. Is it dangerous? Like if somebody's on the side of the road and needs help, do you feel safe? As a woman, I probably would not help people because, one, I'm weak and I can't change a tire, but two, I often would not feel safe helping somebody knowing that something dangerous could happen to me. If you are able to change a tire, are you going to do that on I-35 where there's traffic going by and it's dangerous, or are you only going to be willing to do that on a road where you feel safer? Other situational variables can refer to, do you feel sympathy for the person? You know, if I saw a mom with kids, I'm going to be more likely to want to help them than if I saw what looked like an able-bodied male on the side of the road. Attentional variables relate to where an individual's focus is directed in a given situation. So if somebody asks me to donate money, am I willing to Am I paying attention? Am I focused on a different task? If somebody looks like they need help and I'm on my way somewhere else, am I paying attention and focused on that? The example here, somebody who's in a busy airport, are they running to their flight? They're not going to stop and help somebody. Whereas if somebody's got a lot of time, then they may be willing to stop and help somebody. All right, that is it for this section and for all of social psychology.